The Grand Hall of the Eternal Moon was a masterpiece of supernatural architecture, its vaulted ceilings stretching so high they seemed to touch the stars themselves, massive columns carved from ancient moonstone, glowing with an ethereal silver light that pulsed in rhythm with the collective heartbeats of thousands of werewolves gathered for the most sacred event of the decade. The mating ceremony was held only once every 10 years, a tradition as old as the wolf species itself, where destined mates from every pack across the 5 kingdoms would come together to formalize their bonds before the gods of the moon and the eyes of their entire civilization. Alara Ashwood stood near the very back of the enormous hall, pressed against a cold stone pillar. Trying desperately to make herself even smaller than her Omega status already rendered her in the eyes of nearly everyone present. Her dress, a simple cream-colored gown that had belonged to her mother before her death 12 years ago, had been carefully mended in 3 places where the fabric had worn thin, and though Ilara had spent hours pressing it and adding small embroidered flowers along the hem to make it more presentable, she knew it looked painfully plain compared to the elaborate silks and jeweled gowns surrounding her on all sides. She had known attending the ceremony was a mistake from the moment her supposed mate, Beta Marcus Thorne of the Silvercrest Pack, had made it abundantly clear he had no intention of actually claiming her despite the mate bond that had snapped into place on her 18th birthday 3 years ago. Marcus was everything an ambitious Beta should be. Tall and powerfully built with the golden hair and sharp features that made unmated females of all ranks turn their heads when he passed. And he had made no secret of the fact that he considered being mated to a weak Omega, with no family connections and no particular beauty, to be a cosmic joke of the cruelest kind. For 3 years, Alara had felt the constant pull of the bond, that aching need to be near him, to touch him, to complete what the moon goddess had begun. But Marcus had rejected every attempt she made to speak with him privately, had avoided her at pack gatherings, and had been seen publicly courting Serena Blackthorn, a powerful alpha female from the neighboring Ironwood pack, whose family controlled vast territories and commanded armies of warriors. But tradition demanded that destined mates at least appear together at the mating ceremony, even if they had no intention of completing the bond, and so Marcus had sent a curt message through a pack messenger 3 days before the event, informing Alara that she was required to attend and to stay out of his way once they arrived. The journey to the Celestial City, where the royal palace and the Grand Hall stood at the center of all 5 kingdoms, had taken 2 days by convoy, and Alara had traveled in the last carriage with the Omega servants, listening to them whisper about how tragic it was that she clung to hope of a Beta who openly despised her, how pathetic she appeared to everyone who knew her story. She had said nothing in her own defense because what could she say that would not sound like the desperate pleading of someone who refused to accept reality? Now, standing in this magnificent hall surrounded by couples who gazed at each other with open adoration and joy, Alara felt the full weight of her isolation pressing down on her chest, until she could barely breathe. The ceremony had begun an hour ago, with the High Priestess of the Moon calling forward, pair after pair, to stand before the sacred altar and speak their vows of eternal devotion. And each time a couple completed their bonding, the entire hall would erupt in howls of celebration, the ancient wolf song that honored the joining of souls. Alara had watched 53 couples bond so far, had felt her own unbonded mark burning on her inner wrist, where Marcus's name was written in the flowing script of the moon goddess herself, and had tried not to cry as the reality of her situation became more undeniable with each passing moment. Marcus stood on the opposite side of the hall, with Serena draped on his arm like a living accessory, her crimson dress cut daringly low, and her dark hair piled high in an elaborate style that must have taken hours to achieve. And even from this distance, Alara could see the way Marcus looked at the alpha female with genuine desire and ambition in his eyes. They made a striking couple, powerful and beautiful, and perfectly matched in status and strength, and Alara knew that if the mate bonds could be chosen by logic and strategy, rather than divine intervention, Marcus and Serena would have been destined for each other without question. She had heard the rumors that they were planning to petition the High Council for a bond severance after the ceremony, a rare and dangerous magical procedure that could break a mate. Bond, if both parties agreed, though it often left permanent scars on the souls of those involved, and sometimes drove one or both partners mad with the severing of something the gods themselves had created. The thought of going through a bond severance terrified Alara almost as much as the thought of living the rest of her life connected to someone who wished she did not exist. But she had resigned herself to whatever fate Marcus decided for them both, because she had no power to resist his choices. Omegas in the Silvercrest pack, indeed in most packs across the kingdoms, had virtually no rights when it came to mate bonds. Their voices considered too emotional, and their natures too submissive to make important decisions about their own lives. Alara had grown up watching her mother, also an Omega, suffer through a bond with her father, who had barely acknowledged her existence except when he needed someone to cook or clean or bear him children, and she had promised herself she would never accept that kind of half-life for herself. But here she was anyway, trapped by biology and tradition, and the cruel indifference of the universe. A sudden commotion near the front of the hall pulled Alara from her spiraling thoughts, and she looked up to see Marcus pushing through the crowd with Serena at his side, their expressions radiating arrogant confidence as they approached the high priestess without waiting to be called. The ancient wolf woman, her white hair flowing loose down her back and her eyes glowing with the silver light of moon magic, frowned at the interruption, but gestured for silence as Marcus's voice rang out across the suddenly quiet hall. He announced that he was formally rejecting his mate bond with Alara Ashwood in favor of choosing Serena Blackthorn as his true mate, his voice filled with such conviction and righteousness that several wolves actually applauded his boldness in defying the will of the moon goddess herself. Alara felt the blood drain from her face as every eye in the massive hall suddenly turned to find her, thousands of wolves craning their necks to see the pathetic Omega, who had been so unworthy that her own mate preferred to risk divine punishment rather than claim her. The whispers started immediately, a rustling wave of gossip and judgment that swept through the crowd like wildfire, and Alara heard fragments of their cruel assessments floating through the air like poison. She is so plain. How could any beta want her? I heard. She has no family, no connections at all. Probably cannot even bear strong pups. What was the moon goddess thinking, pairing a beta with such a weak Omega? Maybe the bond was a mistake. Maybe she is cursed. The high priestess raised her hand for silence, her expression grave as she addressed Marcus directly. You understand that rejecting a true mate bond is an offense against the sacred laws of our kind, she said, her voice amplified by magic so that every wolf present could hear her words. Clearly. The bond given by the moon goddess is not a suggestion, but a divine mandate, and to sever it without just cause is to invite her wrath upon yourself and your bloodline. Are you certain this is the path you choose? Beta Marcus Thorn of Silvercrest. Marcus did not hesitate for even a heartbeat. I am certain, he declared, his hand tightening around Serena's waist as he pulled her closer to his side. This Omega has nothing to offer me. No strength, no status, no beauty worth claiming. I reject her completely and choose instead a mate worthy of my rank and my future. He turned slightly to face the crowd, his expression challenging anyone to question his decision. I call upon the High Council to witness my choice and to grant me permission to pursue a bond severance so that I may be free to claim the mate I truly desire. The laughter started somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a single sharp bark of amusement that quickly spread until dozens and then hundreds of wolves were laughing at the spectacle, at the absurdity of an Omega so worthless that her own mate would publicly humiliate her in front of the entire supernatural world, rather than simply ignore her quietly, as so many others did with undesired mates. Alara felt hot tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall, refused to give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break completely. Even as her heart shattered into pieces so small, she was not sure she would ever be able to gather them all again. The pain of the rejection was not just emotional, but physical, the mate bond writhing in her chest, like a living thing being torn apart, while still trying desperately to complete itself. And she pressed one hand against her sternum, as if she could somehow hold herself together through sheer force of will. She was about to turn and flee from the hall, to run as far and as fast as her legs would carry her, and never look back, when a sudden silence fell over the entire assembly that was so complete and so profound that Alara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant, frost forming on the moonstone columns and breath misting in the air as every wolf present went absolutely still, their instincts screaming at them that an apex predator had just entered their midst. Alara looked toward the source of this overwhelming presence and felt her knees nearly buckle as she saw him for the first time. Alpha. King Cassian Nightshade stood from his throne at the very front of the hall, his massive form unfolding with the fluid grace of a born warrior, and even from her position at the back of the room, Alara could feel the raw power radiating from him in waves that made her wolf whimper and press close to her consciousness in instinctive submission. The Alpha King was a legend made flesh, the supreme ruler of all 5 kingdoms and the most powerful werewolf alive, a warrior who had unified the Ao, fractured packs through both brilliant strategy and absolutely ruthless violence when necessary. He had taken the throne at 21 when his father was assassinated during a coup attempt, and in the 15 years since, he had transformed the werewolf kingdoms from a collection of constantly warring territories into a unified empire that even the vampire covens and fey courts respected and feared in equal measure. But it was not his political power or his military genius that made Cassian truly terrifying to those who knew his reputation. It was the fact that he was the first Alpha King in 500 years to be born with the ancient gift, a rare and dangerous form of moon magic that allowed him to not only command other wolves through the force of his alpha dominance, but to actually reach into their minds and bend their wills to his own, to make them see visions or feel emotions that were not real, to break their psyche with nothing more than a thought if he chose to be cruel. The ancient gift had driven many of its bearers mad over the centuries, the power too vast for mortal minds to contain safely. But Cassian wielded it with absolute control, using it sparingly but decisively to maintain order across his territories. He was dressed entirely in black, from his tailored jacket to his boots, the only color the deep crimson of the royal crest embroidered over his heart, and the heavy platinum crown that rested on his dark hair. His face was all sharp angles and harsh planes, a warrior's face that had seen too much blood and death to ever be called kind, though Alara could not deny that he was devastatingly handsome in the way that dangerous predators were beautiful, all lethal grace and barely contained violence. His eyes, glowing bright gold with his wolf's presence so close to the surface, swept across the hall with an intensity that made several wolves actually step back in fear. And then those eyes locked directly onto Alara, where she stood frozen, against her pillar. The Alpha King began to walk, his footsteps echoing in the absolute silence like thunder, and the crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship, wolves scrambling to move out of his path as he crossed the enormous hall with his gaze never leaving Alara's face. She wanted to run, every instinct screaming at her to flee from this apex predator who was stalking toward her with such focused intensity, but her legs refused to obey her commands, her body locked in, placed by the weight of his presence, and the inexplicable feeling that something world-changing was about to happen. As he drew closer, Alara could see details she had missed from a distance. The thin white scars that marked his hands and one side of his jaw, evidence of countless battles fought and survived. The way his shoulders were so broad they seemed to block out everything else in her field of vision. The subtle darkness under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and the weight of an entire species resting on his shoulders. If you enjoyed this moment where everything changed, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more supernatural romance stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Drop a comment below, telling me what you think the Alpha King is about to do, because trust me, this story is just getting started. When Cassian reached her, he stopped exactly 3 feet away, close enough that Alara could feel the heat radiating from his body and catch his scent, a mixture of pine forest and winter storms, and something wild and untamed that made her wolf surge forward in her mind with a desperation she had never experienced before. The Alpha King studied her face for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable, and then slowly, deliberately, he sank down on one knee before her, lowering himself so that his eyes were level with hers. The gasps that rippled through the crowd were deafening in their shock, because an Alpha King knelt for no one. It was an act of submission that defied every law of their hierarchical society, and yet here he was, kneeling in front of the weakest Omega in the hall as if she were the one who wore the crown instead of him. "Elara Ashwood," Cassian said, his voice pitched low enough that only she and perhaps the wolves nearest to them could hear, though she suspected every enhanced ear in the hall was straining to catch his words. "Do you know who I am?" She managed a jerky nod, her throat too, tight with fear and confusion to form actual words. He smiled then, just the barest curve of his lips, and it transformed his harsh face into something almost gentle. "Good," he said. "Then you know that I do not kneel lightly, and I do not make pronouncements without absolute certainty." Her heart was beating so fast now she thought it might burst from her chest, and she could feel her mark burning on her wrist, not with the pain of Marcus's rejection, but with something else, something that felt like recognition and completion, and coming home all at once. The Alpha King reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose, and took her right hand in both of his calloused fingers warm and gentle as they cradled her much smaller hand like something precious and fragile. He turned her hand over, exposing the inner wrist where Marcus's name had been written in silver script since her 18th birthday, and Elara watched in absolute astonishment as the name began to fade before her eyes, the letters dissolving like mist in sunlight. In their place, new words appeared in letters of pure gold that seemed to glow with their own inner light, letters that spelled out a name she had never expected to see on her skin: Cassian Nightshade. True mate. Eternal bond. The Alpha King looked up at her then, his gold eyes blazing with an intensity that took her breath away, and when he spoke again, his voice rang out across the entire hall, amplified by his power so that there could be no doubt, no misunderstanding about what was happening. "I, Cassian Nightshade, Alpha King of the 5 Kingdoms, and Guardian of the Wolf Nations, do hereby claim Elara Ashwood as my true mate, chosen by the Moon Goddess herself, and written in the stars before either of us drew breath." He rose to his feet then, still holding her hand, and turned to face the assembled crowd. "Let it be known to all wolves present, and to the gods themselves, that this woman is my destined mate, my queen, my equal in all things, and any who dare to harm her or speak against her will answer to me personally." The hall erupted in chaos, wolves shouting and gasping and arguing, some bowing immediately in respect while others looked like they might actually challenge the king's pronouncement, their faces twisted with disbelief and outrage. Elara saw Marcus pushing through the crowd, his face purple with rage, and heard him shouting something about false bonds and political manipulation, but his voice was drowned out by the dozens of other conversations happening simultaneously. The High Priestess stepped forward, her expression grave, but her eyes shining with something that looked almost like relief, and she raised both hands for silence. When order was finally restored, she approached Cassian and Elara, her gaze moving between them with an intensity that made Elara shiver. "The bonds written by the Moon Goddess cannot be denied or questioned," the High Priestess said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition and sacred law. "I see the mark upon Lady Elara's wrist, clear as day, and written in the gold of royal destiny." She turned to address the crowd directly. "There are bonds of silver, which connect most mates, and there are bonds of gold, which appear perhaps once in a generation, and signify a pairing of profound importance to our entire species. The last golden bond recorded in our histories was 300 years ago, between King Aldrich the Wise and Queen Morena, the healer, whose reign brought the great peace that lasted for a century." She looked back at Cassian and Elara, her expression solemn. "The Moon Goddess has given us another golden bond, and we ignore it at our peril." Marcus finally forced his way to the front of the crowd, Serena still clinging to his arm, though she looked considerably less confident now than she had moments ago. "This is insane," Marcus snarled, his eyes blazing with fury as he glared at Elara like she had somehow orchestrated this entire situation. She is nobody, nothing, a weak Omega, with no power and no worth. How could she possibly be the true mate of the Alpha King? He turned to Cassian, his expression challenging despite the obvious danger of confronting the most powerful wolf alive. With respect, Your Majesty, I believe there has been some mistake. This Omega was marked as my mate 3 years ago, and while I have chosen to reject that bond, it does not mean she can simply transfer her attentions to someone of higher status. This reeks of manipulation and deception. The temperature in the hall dropped even further, ice crystals forming on the windows and frost spreading across the floor from where Cassian stood, and Alara felt the Alpha King's power pressing down on the assembly like a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. When Cassian spoke, his voice was soft and cold and more terrifying than any shout could have been. You dare to question a golden bond, Beta Thorn. You dare to suggest that I, who can read the truth in any wolf's heart with a single glance, have been deceived by an Omega you yourself called worthless moments ago. He took a single step toward Marcus, and the Beta actually stumbled backward in fear, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of the king's displeasure. Your bond with Lady Alara was written in silver, a standard connection that, while sacred, was not one of cosmic significance. My bond with her is written in gold, a pairing ordained by the gods themselves for reasons that extend far beyond personal desire or political advantage. Cassian's eyes began to glow brighter, the ancient gift manifesting visibly as silver light joined the gold in his irises, and his voice took on a resonance that suggested he was speaking not just with his own authority, but with something older and far more powerful flowing through him. I have known for 5 years that Alara Ashwood was my true mate, he said, and the hall fell into shocked silence at this revelation. I have watched over her from a distance, unable to claim her because the silver bond with you had manifested first, and tradition demanded that bond be given a chance to fulfill itself or be properly rejected. He looked at Alara then, his expression softening slightly. I have waited in agony, feeling the pull of our connection while knowing I could not act without breaking the very laws I am sworn to uphold. But tonight, Beta Thorn, you publicly rejected her. You severed the silver bond before the gods and this entire assembly, and in doing so, you freed her to accept the golden bond that has been waiting all along. Alara felt tears streaming down her face now, but these were not tears of humiliation or pain. They were tears of overwhelming emotion as the full weight of what was happening finally crashed over her. The Alpha King, the most powerful and feared wolf in existence, had been waiting for her, watching over her, unable to claim her because of tradition and honor. All those times over the past 5 years when she had felt inexplicably safe despite her vulnerable position. Those moments when she could have sworn someone was watching her from the shadows but no one was ever there. The mysterious gifts that had appeared on her doorstep with no note or explanation. Food when she was hungry, and medicine when she was sick. And once, memorably, an entire set of books on moon magic and Omega empowerment that she had treasured but never understood the source of. It had been him. All along, it had been him. The High Priestess stepped between Cassian and Marcus, her expression making it clear that she would tolerate no further challenges to what the moon goddess had decreed. The golden bond is recognized and sacred, she declared. Beta Thorn, you are released from any obligation to Lady Alara, and are free to pursue your chosen bond with Alpha Serena Blackthorn if you both still wish it. She turned to Cassian and Alara, her ancient eyes shining with approval. Your Majesty, Lady Alara, would you complete the bonding ceremony now, before this assembly, so that none may question or challenge what the gods have written? Cassian looked down at Alara, his expression open and vulnerable in a way that shocked her given his fearsome reputation. The choice is yours, he said softly, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. I will not force this bond upon you, despite what tradition and law might allow. If you need time to process what has happened, to decide if you can accept a life at my side with all the danger and responsibility that entails, I will wait. I have already waited 5 years. I can wait longer if that is what you need. Alara looked up at this powerful, dangerous, legendary man who was offering her a choice no Omega in her position had ever been given, who was looking at her not with the contempt and disgust she had grown accustomed to seeing in Marcus's eyes, but with something that looked almost like worship. Like she was the valuable one, and he was the lucky one to have found her. She thought about the life she had been resigned to accepting, forever bound to a man who despised her, forever treated as less than human by a pack that saw no worth in her existence. She thought about the years of loneliness and pain, the constant ache of being unwanted and invisible, and then she thought about the possibility of something different, something better, a bond with someone who had apparently been watching over her and protecting her, even when she had no idea he existed. Someone who knelt before her and called her his equal despite the vast difference in their power and status. The answer came to her with absolute certainty, rising from somewhere deep in her soul, where her wolf waited with eager anticipation. "Yes," Alara whispered, her voice growing stronger as she repeated herself. "Yes, I accept this bond. I accept you as my mate and my king." A smile spread across Cassian's face, transforming him from terrifying warrior to something almost boyish in his obvious joy, and he pulled her close, one hand cupping her face with such tenderness she wondered how anyone could have ever called him heartless or cruel. The high priestess began the traditional bonding ceremony, her words flowing in the ancient language of their kind, and Alara felt the golden bond between them snap into place fully, a connection so powerful and so right that she gasped aloud at the intensity of it. When Cassian finally kissed her, sealing the bond before the gods in the assembly, the entire hall erupted in howls of celebration that shook the very foundations of the building, and Alara heard the voice of the moon goddess herself whispering in her mind, "Welcome home, little Omega. Welcome to your true destiny." As the kiss deepened and the bond settled into place, glowing golden chains of light visible to every wolf present, wrapping around both her and Cassian in an intricate pattern that spoke of unbreakable connection. Alara caught sight of Marcus in the crowd, his face twisted with disbelief, and what might have been regret, and she felt absolutely nothing for him anymore. No pain, no longing, just a distant sort of pity for a man who had thrown away something precious because he could not see value in anything that did not immediately serve his ambition. The celebration that followed the bonding ceremony was unlike anything Alara had ever experienced, with wolves from all 5 kingdoms coming forward to offer their congratulations and formally acknowledge her as their new queen. But she barely registered most of it, because all of her attention was focused on the man at her side, her mate, her king, who had not released her hand even once since claiming her. It was not until much later, when they finally escaped to the private royal chambers high in the palace tower, that Cassian explained the full truth of what their bonding meant, not just for them, but for their entire species. He told her about the ancient prophecy that had been whispered among the royal family for generations, a prophecy that spoke of a time when the wolf nations would face extinction unless a golden bond appeared to unite the kingdoms under a king and queen who could bridge the divide between power and compassion, strength and mercy, dominance and understanding. He told her that 5 years ago, on her 18th birthday, he had felt the golden bond snap into place from hundreds of miles away, a connection so powerful it had brought him to his knees in the middle of a war council. And he had known in that moment that she was the one the prophecy spoke of, the Omega Queen who would help him transform their species from a collection of fractured packs obsessed with hierarchy and dominance into something better, something stronger, a true nation united by justice and mutual respect, rather than fear and tradition. He explained that he could not simply claim her immediately, because the silver bond with Marcus had already manifested. An ancient law required that bond to run its course naturally, but he had used his resources and his power to watch over her, to protect her from dangers she never knew threatened her, to ensure that when the moment finally came for them to be together, she would be safe and whole. Alara listened to all of this with growing wonder, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he was telling her, the idea that her existence had significance beyond her own small life, that the moon goddess had marked her for a purpose that extended to the survival of their entire species. And then she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since he first knelt before her. "Why me?" she whispered. I am nobody, nothing special. I have no power, no great abilities. What could I possibly offer that would make me worthy of a golden bond and a prophecy and you?" Cassian pulled her into his arms then, his embrace warm and secure and making her feel safer than she had ever felt in her life. And when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "You have everything that matters," he said. "You have compassion that has not been destroyed despite years of cruelty. You have strength that manifests not as dominance, but as resilience. The ability to endure suffering without becoming bitter or cruel yourself. You have wisdom enough to question unjust traditions, rather than accepting them, simply because they have always been." He pulled back, slightly so he could look into her eyes. "The prophecy does not speak of a queen with vast power or unmatched beauty or political connections, Alara. It speaks of a queen with a heart pure enough to see what needs to change, and a will strong enough to make those changes despite opposition. That is you. That has always been you." As the days and weeks passed following their bonding, Alara discovered that being the queen of the werewolf kingdoms was both more wonderful and more terrifying than she could have imagined. Cassian was a patient and devoted mate, teaching her everything she needed to know about politics and governance, about the delicate balance of power between the different packs, about the threats they faced from external enemies and internal dissent. He introduced her to his inner circle, the small group of wolves he trusted absolutely, and she was surprised to find that several of them were also omegas, or lower-ranking wolves, who had proven their worth through merit rather than birth. He explained that he had been slowly working to change the rigid hierarchy that oppressed so many wolves, but that his efforts had been limited by tradition and the powerful alphas who benefited from the current system and resisted any reforms that might diminish their own status. But now, with a golden bond and a prophecy to give weight to their actions, Cassian and Alara began to implement sweeping changes that sent shockwaves through every pack in the 5 kingdoms. They issued a royal decree that outlawed the practice of forced matings, declaring that all wolves had the right to reject a mate bond if they chose. Though they would face social consequences and the personal pain of rejection, no wolf could be compelled to complete a bond against their will. They established a council of omegas who would have direct access to the king and queen, and whose voices would carry equal weight to the Alpha Council in all matters of law and policy. They created sanctuaries in every kingdom where abused or rejected omegas could find shelter and protection and training in skills that would allow them to support themselves independently of any pack if they chose. The resistance to these changes was fierce and sometimes violent, with several powerful alphas openly challenging Cassian's authority, and even attempting a coup that would have succeeded if not for the loyalty of the wolves Cassian had elevated based on merit rather than birth. Alara herself became a target of assassination attempts 3 times in the first 6 months of her reign, and each time, Cassian's fury was terrible to behold. His ancient gift used to root out the conspirators and deliver justice that was swift and absolute. But through it all, Alara stood firm in her convictions, using her position to give voice to the voiceless, to shine light on injustices that had been accepted for generations, simply because they had always been that way. She discovered that she had gifts of her own, not the dramatic powers of an alpha, or even the ancient gift that made Cassian so feared, but something perhaps more important, the ability to see people truly, to understand their motivations and fears, to find common ground between wolves who thought they were enemies, to heal divisions through empathy and honest conversation. It was during a visit to the Silvercrest Pack, her former home, that Alara came face to face with Marcus for the first time since the ceremony. He looked diminished somehow, his earlier confidence and arrogance replaced by something that looked like bitterness and regret. His bond with Serena had been completed, but it was apparently not the partnership of equals he had envisioned, as Serena's family used their power and connections to control every aspect of Marcus's life, treating him more like a useful tool than a valued mate. He approached Alara during a public forum she was holding to hear grievances from Omega Pack members, and after a long moment of tense silence, he spoke. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About you. About everything. I see now what I threw away in my arrogance and ambition. I see the queen you have become, and I realize that the moon goddess knew what she was doing all along when she first marked you as my mate. I was the one who was not worthy, not you." Alara looked at the man who had caused her so much pain, who had rejected her publicly and cruelly, and she felt nothing but a distant sort of pity for what he had lost through his own choices. "I forgive you, Marcus," she said, and meant it, not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying anger and resentment serves no purpose in my life now. You chose status and power over authentic connection, and that choice has consequences you must live with. But I hope you learn from this. I hope you become a better man and a better mate to Serena, because everyone deserves the chance to grow beyond their mistakes." She turned away then, returning to the Omega who had been speaking before Marcus interrupted, making it clear that she had more important concerns than relitigating the past. As years passed and the reforms Alara and Cassian implemented began to reshape their society, the prophecy proved its truth in ways even Cassian had not fully anticipated. The wolf nations, which had been slowly declining in both population and power for generations, suddenly began to flourish. Birth rates increased as Omegas who felt safe and valued were more willing to bear pups. Conflicts between packs decreased dramatically as the new emphasis on merit and justice, rather than mere dominance, gave lower-ranking wolves legitimate paths to improve their status without resorting to violence. Relations with vampires and fae improved, as both species recognized that the werewolves under Cassian and Alara's rule were becoming a more stable and trustworthy ally, rather than the chaotic and aggressive threat they had been historically. And through it all, the bond between Cassian and Alara only grew stronger, their connection deepening from the initial rush of mate bond intensity into something richer and more profound, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose, and a love that had been tested by fire and emerged unbreakable. Alara never forgot that night in the Grand Hall, when she had stood alone and humiliated, convinced that she was worthless and unwanted, never knowing that the most powerful wolf in existence was watching, her with absolute devotion, waiting for the moment when tradition would finally allow him to claim her. She used that memory to fuel her work, to remind herself why fighting for the vulnerable and the overlooked mattered so much, because she had been one of them, and she knew exactly how it felt to be invisible in a society that valued strength and status above all else. On the 5th anniversary of their bonding, Cassian took Alara back to the Grand Hall of the Eternal Moon, which had been transformed from a place of humiliation into one of triumph in her memory. They renewed their vows before a much smaller and more intimate gathering, just their inner circle and the high priestess who had witnessed their original bonding. As they stood together before the sacred altar, hands clasped and golden bond marks glowing brightly on both their wrists, the high priestess spoke words that captured everything their union had come to mean. 5 years ago, the moon goddess gave our people a gift we did not fully understand, she said. She gave us a golden bond, a pairing of king and queen who would transform our species from within. She gave us an alpha king with the power to enforce change, and an omega queen with the heart to know what changes were needed. Together, you have exceeded every expectation, fulfilled every promise of the prophecy, and built a future for our kind that is brighter than any we have known in living memory. Alara looked out at the faces gathered to celebrate with them and saw representatives from every level of their society, alphas and omegas and everyone in between. Wolves who would never have been in the same room together 5 years ago, let alone celebrating as equals. She thought about how far they had come and how much further they still had to go, because changing a society was not the work of a few years but of generations, and the structures of oppression they were dismantling had been built over centuries. But she also felt hope, genuine and unshakable hope, because she had seen what was possible when people chose compassion over cruelty, justice over tradition, and love over fear. She had lived the transformation herself, from invisible Omega to Queen. And if her story could be rewritten by the grace of the moon goddess and the devotion of a king who saw her worth when no one else did, then anything was possible. As the ceremony concluded and the celebration began, Cassian pulled Alara into a quiet corner, away from the crowd, and kissed her with the same intensity and devotion he had shown on that first night. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, he rested his forehead against hers and spoke words that made her heart swell with joy. "I would live through those 5 years of waiting 1,000 times over if it meant ending here with you," he said. "You are my mate, my queen, my equal, my everything. Thank you for being brave enough to accept a destiny you never asked for standing beside me, even when it would have been easier to run, for showing our people what true strength really looks like." Alara smiled up at the man who had changed her entire world with a single choice to kneel before her, when he could have simply commanded her obedience. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible," she whispered. "Thank you for waiting when you could have simply taken what you wanted. Thank you for being the kind of king who understands that real power is not about dominance but about lifting others up." "Together," she said, her voice filled with certainty and joy, "we are going to change everything." And they did. The story of the Omega Queen and her Alpha King became legend, told to pups across all 5 kingdoms as an example of how the moon goddess works in mysterious ways, how those who are overlooked and underestimated often carry within them the seeds of greatness, how true mates are not just about personal happiness, but about fulfilling a larger purpose together. Alara never forgot the girl she had been, standing alone in that grand hall being mocked and rejected, and she made sure that no Omega in her kingdoms would ever have to endure that kind of humiliation again. And Cassian, who had been called heartless and cruel by those who did not understand that sometimes the greatest love manifests as patience and protection from a distance, proved that even the most powerful predator could kneel before his mate and call her his queen, his equal, his salvation. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next supernatural romance tale. Leave a comment sharing your favorite moment from Alara and Cassian's journey, and let me know what kind of story you would like to see next. Until then, remember that sometimes the person the world overlooks is exactly the person destiny has been saving for something extraordinary.